Are the U.S. and China dragging the world toward a new Cold War? The UN Secretary-General begs Beijing and Washington to bury the hatchet or risk starting a new conflict and more global chaos. But how much is either side willing to compromise? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the strained relationship between the U.S. and China. Massive militaries, mammoth economies, and power beyond measure. The U.S. and China are two of the world's most dominant nations, so when there's tension between them, there is cause for concern. At this week's United Nations General Assembly, Antonio Guterres called on Washington and Beijing to repair their completely dysfunctional relationship before the superpowers set off a new, more dangerous Cold War.
It will be impossible to address dramatic economic and developed challenges while the world's two largest economies are at odds with each other. Yet I fear our world is creeping towards two different sets of economic, trade, financial, and technological rules, two divergent approaches in the development of artificial intelligence, and ultimately, the risk of two different military and geopolitical strategies. And this is a recipe for trouble. It would be far less predictable than the Cold War.
Now, the U.S. and China have at times had a very hostile rivalry over the years, but under the previous administration of Donald Trump, the relationship saw new lows. The controversial U.S. president accused China of unfair trade practices that set off a massive trade war, and they repeatedly clashed over the coronavirus. But Beijing is dealing with Joe Biden now, and while he didn't mention China directly during his speech at the UN, he was clearly sending them a message.
The United States will compete, and will compete vigorously, and lead with our values and our strength. We'll stand up for our allies and our friends and oppose attempts by stronger countries to dominate weaker ones, whether through changes to territory by force, economic coercion, technical exploitation, or disinformation. But we're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks.
But Joe Biden wasn't the only world leader to use his speech as an opportunity to take a swipe at an adversary. Xi Jinping did exactly the same. The Chinese president didn't travel to New York, but in his own virtual address to the UN, he subtly called out Washington for its failures in Afghanistan.
A
world of peace and development should embrace civilizations of various forms and must accommodate diverse paths to modernization. Democracy is not a special right reserved to an individual country, but a right for the people of all countries to enjoy. Recent developments in the global situation show once again that military intervention from the outside and so-called democratic transformation entail nothing but harm. We need to advocate peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom, which are common values of humanity, and reject the practice of forming small circles or zero-sum games.
Well, it's clear there's no love lost between the U.S. and China, but a new Cold War could be catastrophic for all. So can Biden and Xi find a way to cooperate? Or are we destined for more dangerous diplomatic disputes? To discuss that, I am joined now from Beijing by Victor Gao, the director of the China National Association of International Studies. From Taipei is Asia political risk analyst Ross Feingold. And from London is Zeno Leoni, a fellow at the Defense Studies Department of King's College London. He's also got an upcoming book on the new Cold War between U.S. and China. Thanks so much for being with us. President Biden has said, as we heard there, that the U.S. is not seeking a new Cold War, but at the same time, he'll argue the planet kind of has the democratic values of the West on the one side and the authoritarianism, he thinks, of China on the other. So Ross, I'll start with you. Doesn't that divide describe the axis that defined the Cold War?
Well, sort of yes and sort of no. I mean, we have to be realistic in our assessment of President Biden's foreign policy, whether it's with regard to China, Russia, Iran, maybe potentially North Korea as well. And based on his own experience as a senator during the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, in the period when there was a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, it's clear that President Biden and his team, they still believe very much in dialogue, whether it's with, as I said, Russia, China, Iran. Yes, they've maintained some of the Trump administration policies towards China. They've taken some significant actions like the submarine agreement that was announced last week. But it very much remains to be seen whether Biden is going to fulfill or continue the policy trajectory that we saw under the Trump administration. And frankly, that gives some critics reason for a lot of concern about what Biden really intends, and if he in fact does intend a posture that's more akin to the Soviet-U.S. Cold War. Frankly, I think it's just too early to make that determination.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, Victor, though, if we actually look at Biden's speech to the UN, versus what we saw under Trump, some are saying the tone has changed, but the substance kind of hasn't. What do you think?
Well, I listened very carefully to what President Biden had to say at the United Nations General Assembly. He seemed to have talked a lot of good talk. However, what will matter most and more is to walk the right walk. For example, he said cooperation and global international cooperation, etc. This is all good talk, but whether the United States really mean it, really they want to push away the prospect of a Cold War or even another war, for example. There are people in the United States who've written books about destined to war, who come up with theories about Thucydides' trap, for example. They are urging the United States to be prepared for a total war against China. Now, the United States government, President Biden in particular at this particular point, need to come up with a very clear message. That is, war will not save America. War will be Armageddon for both China and the United States and mankind as a whole. We need to embrace peace rather than preparing for a war, cold or hot. He didn't say that much in his speech. In that sense, it was a disappointment.
Okay. Zeno, let me just get your thoughts on what we've heard out of Joe Biden and, of course, President Xi Jinping over the course of the UNGA.
Thank you. So I would agree that Biden is more institutionally sensitive compared to Trump. And I also genuinely believe that Biden would like to improve this relationship. However, one of an area that interests me the most here is this one. Can leaders improve this relationship? Is within the reach of the Biden administration, within Biden's power to improve this relationship? I'm asking this question because the problems that the US and China are facing nowadays are structural. They date back many decades. And so we need to go back to Nixon, Kissinger, Carter, why the US wanted to normalize relations with China. The US wanted China to open up, to become a capitalist country. The US wanted China to be one of the locomotives of the world economy. Unfortunately, China has achieved that in a very efficient manner, and at the end of this story, it has become a very competitive power, a great power. And actually, this is a sort of backlash in the way the US has dealt with China over the last few decades. And China has become competitive over the strategic sectors of contemporary, modern industries, and it has also reinvested some of the money that it's making to sharpen up its military power over a very strategic region of the world, the South China Sea. So it's a very complex form of interdependence between these two great powers, difficult for any single individual to resolve.
Right. Very interesting, Zeno. I mean, because the way you looked back at the history, someone could have easily said, to the United States, be careful what you wish for. Telling China to open up, integrate, build your industries, and we can all trade and profit together. And now we are where we are today. But Ross, let me turn back to you. Yeah, because, you know, the United States has long defended itself as being the defender of democracy around the world, that its values are important to spread and to protect. So what responsibility does the U.S. have now to protect those values? If China, for example, does go after Taiwan, will the U.S. be obligated to step in militarily? And China feels that on the other end, and that is part of that Cold War dynamic that China has been talking about.
Well, certainly an issue that there's speculation every day here in Taipei, where I'm speaking from, whether or not the United States would come to Taiwan's assistance in the event of a military conflict between China and Taiwan. Certainly, we don't know for sure what the level of support among the American public would be for that as well, although recent polls show that support in the United States for assisting Taiwan in a military conflict is in fact increasing. But to answer your question more specifically about U.S. obligations around the world or even here in Asia, the reality is that the United States is bound by treaty to assist certain countries in this part of the world, such as Japan, as well as the Philippines. So just by virtue of the treaty arrangements, the United States may become involved in conflict because those countries might have a conflict with China. So even if it's not about spreading democracy per se, there are a number of contingencies where it's very possible that the United States will become involved in a military conflict. Also, I think it's worth keeping in mind that a number of issues in the U.S.-China relationship that are currently contentious are not issues that are going to be solved or lead to a military conflict. For example, the United States would like China to purchase more U.S. goods. The United States would like China to lower tariffs on U.S. goods and to allow U.S. companies to operate in China on the same basis that Chinese companies have operated in the United States. I mean, that's a trade dispute. Obviously, that's not a sovereignty dispute. It's unlikely to lead to a military conflict. But there's still a need for both sides to talk about something like that. But on the Chinese side as well.
Okay. Zeno, I'll come back to you in just a second, but I really wanted to get Victor's thoughts on the Taiwan issue I just proposed there. What if, the United States did, if China did make the military move that it has at a number of occasions threatened to make, and the U.S. would try to step in, where would that lead?
Well, first of all, allow me to be very brief in going back to the history. Ever since 1949, all the way up to President Nixon summit visit to China, the United States actually supported Taiwan, the Republic of China, as the sole legitimate representative of China. A great contribution made by Nixon was that he wanted to make that switch from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China, that is from Taiwan to China's mainland. And ever since 1979, the United States fully acknowledged that China, the People's Republic of China, is the sole legitimate representative of China, and Taiwan is part of China. Now, remember, back in 1978, the United States and Taiwan had a mutual defense treaty. The United States had to go all the way to cancel that defense treaty. The United States stationed the U.S. troops in Taiwan. They had to recall all the troops. The United States recognized the Republic of China and had diplomatic relations, and the United States had to make that fundamental switch from Taiwan to China. Now, move fast track to today. I can bet with you, the United States will never allow American life to be lost for defending Taiwan against what? It's not an invasion from mainland. It's the reunification of China. That is the reunification of China's mainland with Taiwan. We prefer reunification in peaceful ways, but if that does not work, reunification has to be achieved at whatever way, whatever cost. So the US government should be fully aware what they will do and what they should not do. I think the United States just want to be the largest arms dealer as far as its relations with Taiwan is concerned. You talk about democracy, human rights, etc. If they are serious Back in 1979, the United States government would not have canceled the defense treaty with Taiwan.
Okay. Let me get Zeno's take on that. I mean, especially Victor saying that, the United States would never want to see a single life lost over Taiwan, but that China is ready to go all the way militarily if it needs to reunify the island with the mainland. Is that true, in your opinion?
So we can only look at the treaty that binds the U.S. to Taiwan. Is not a sort of Article 5 kind of thing. It's not mandatory for the U.S. to rescue Taiwan. It will depend on what Congress will decide. It will be very much up to the Congress. And we have seen, on the one hand, we have seen in U.S.-China relations in history that Congress was always more hawkish than the White House, was always trying to counterbalance the actions taken by the White House. And that's why nowadays we have that treaty between the US and Taiwan, is because Congress wanted to counterbalance the rapprochement, the normalization that happened during the Carter administration. So on the one hand, I might say, yes, Congress will be hawkish about that. But on the other hand, as Victor said, loss of lives of American troops might be an important part of the calculations done within Congress.
Okay, let me just get Ross's quick point of view on that, if you don't mind. To say that the United States would never want to lose a life over Taiwan, is that true? Is that where the U.S. would draw the line? And in which case, China could easily militarily overpower Taiwan?
Yeah, I disagree, because this is all a matter of speculation, because we don't know the circumstances under which such a contingency would occur. But again, the support in the United States Congress and increasingly in the public is, frankly, I mean, that's just the reality, that the support is growing that the United States will come to Taiwan's assistance.
Okay. If I can change tact here, because there's another important issue to speak about. China and the U.S., Ross, I'll stick with you. Are they at least on the same page regarding climate change? I mean, Biden says he's committed, and China has now promised not to build coal-fired power plants abroad. Does that amount to committing to combating climate change? And if so, I mean, could that at least help in some way to unify the U.S. and China?
Well, it's only one among the many issues that are on the bilateral agenda. John Kerry, the climate change czar, as we often call him, went to China recently, but the trip wasn't very successful for a number of reasons, including that an appropriate level official from the Chinese government didn't meet him in person, and he was forced to meet via video, even though he was actually in China. Biden administration faces enormous pressure from Congress and increasingly the public not to give away too much, not just to China, but to other countries or in multilateral agreements on the climate change issue as well. And frankly, they're running out of time now that we're getting close to 1 year until the midterm election. And there are other issues on the agenda of Congress related to domestic spending. So how much room the Biden administration actually has to reach grand deals on climate change, whether with China or any other country or a multilateral organization, frankly, is very limited. It really remains to be seen what kind of deal that the U.S. and China really have the political willingness or how much political capital they're willing to spend on a climate change agreement.
Okay, Victor, at least from China's perspective, what kind of political capital does Beijing have to spend, and how important is it to China to see curbed climate change, and would they be willing to coordinate with the United States in that battle?
Well, thank you very much. This is a very important question. First of all, mankind is faced with a real climate change crisis, and any attempt to solve the climate change crisis by mankind cannot be fruitful without close cooperation between China and the United States. Therefore, it's only logical that China and the United States need to figure out a way to cooperate very closely on climate change for their own benefit as well as for the benefit of mankind. But coming back to your question as to why China-US relations are so strained, I would say the United States considers itself as the top dog in the world, and it's worried that China will push it out of that position. But the reality is that China has no desire to replace the United States as the top dog. But if the United States is worried that Chinese economy eventually will be larger than the US economy, come on, this is a megatrend. No one can stop it. The Chinese economy will one day be larger than that of the United States. So the United States need to come to terms with the fact that the Chinese economy will be larger than that, and they need to structure their geopolitical position on that premise rather than against that premise. I think in the medium and longer term, China and the United States need to get along with each other.
Okay.
I've written an article called Inevitable Peace Between China and the United States, meaning we are not destined to war. We are at an inevitable peace period. We will need to get along with each other peacefully rather than confrontationally.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could all get along, but each side accuses the other of being, a provocateur of sorts. I mean, let me put that to Zeno. Is there a provocateur here? I mean, and if this is a new Cold War developing, what about the bigger picture axes that could be at play? Who's on which side here? Is it not just the United States and China, that there will be alliances formed that could potentially threaten each other on a much wider scale?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think there is a villain here. I think we need to understand the two sides of the same coin of the international order. So on the one hand, we have lived since the end of World War II in this liberal international order based on rule of law, which was very much a US-friendly, US-sponsored, an order convenient to the United States. And so in a way, China is right in challenging that with its selective approach to globalization. And the US, in a way, shouldn't be upset. But on the other hand, the West has been asking China to liberalize for many, many years, and China, in a way, has been cheeky about it. But there's no truth here. There are two truths, equally important, right? In terms of alliances, China is struggling at the moment, would be struggling if there was a sort of, a new kind of Cold War or a World War III happening, because China doesn't have a formal military partnership in place at the moment, while the US has those all over the world, and that was the whole point of the US hegemony. So I think China will be extremely careful, and that's part of his Sun Tzu style approach to military affairs, or Marxist approach to military affairs. China will be very careful to take the right steps, and so to take the steps that can actually, where it can manage the consequences of the implication of its military steps. And in a way, that's quite reassuring for the whole world. It means that for a few years we will have that kind of inevitable peace that was just mentioned.
Okay, Ross, we have just a few minutes left. I can give you some quick final words.
I was very interested to hear Victor Gao say that China doesn't want to be the top dog. It made me think that if China wanted to offer that on paper to the United States, perhaps that the two sides could actually resolve many of their differences. But to be serious, clearly China has its aspirations, whether in trade or military. And that's understandable. It's a large country, and it's now one of the major economies in the world. And Xi Jinping talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. I mean, that's not a surprise. But where we need to find ways to get along would be how those policy goals manifest itself with China's relations with other countries, not just here in East Asia, but in Europe and obviously with the United States.
Okay, Victor, last 45 seconds.
Thank you. Let us all work together to promote peace between China and the United States. And we all need to fight against any provocation for war or conflict or confrontation between these two largest economies in the world. Inevitable peace should be the future for China and the United States. Thank you.
Largest economies and the largest militaries. All right, Victor Gao, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. And of course, to our viewers for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.